Recording.
Oh, yeah. Is that up to you, Taylor, or do I need to do that?
Oh, I started it just now.
Good. Excellent. Okay, so here we go.
Hello, my name is Etienne, and I was born in France, in a city whose cathedrals copied my name. Also with a museum by Shigeru Ban. When I saw it, I thought, why don't I do the same? So I studied architecture, that's why I moved to Nancy. No, that's not a girl, that's the name of the city. I got my bachelor's degree, then I moved to Germany, in Leipzig, then New Berlin, where I mastered my physics. Monster in the pocket, now I'm on the market, rising like a rocket. Let's go win some contests. I this competition, living in the future. First prize, World Championship of Game for Architecture, Public Award, and a whole bunch of trophies that I cannot name all the song would last a century. While learning the basics in various offices, I've explored several parallel careers, from making and mixing cheese in Switzerland to drawing the local TV in Belgium. Then I worked for Sana on the set of the Louvre, and now for 4 years I've been working in Luxembourg. But it's time to live, Denmark is on my list. I want to work for big, I know I've got the skills. My English is great, mon français formidable. Mein Deutsch ist super, mit uns verfertigt. I know AutoCAD, Rhinoceros, Grasshopper, and V-Ray, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, and After Effects. I wanna meet Jog and his hip-hop ego. I wanna build cool stuff with Lego. Yes, I want that job and you can't say no. You're gonna say yes and I'm gonna say yo. Is more. Is more. Is more. Is more. Is more.
Oops. Oh, man, I killed it. All right. Anyway, you get the point. So that is an actual portfolio. I came across that a few years ago, and that was used by that Danish student. I don't know if he got the job or not, but that actually kind of made its rounds on the internet after he published that. So you can hear me okay? I didn't mess up the audio too much. Good. All right, I'll carry on with this. So yeah, as I said, that was somebody's very
Is more. Man, don't miss out on this occasion. I'm the very next step in this evolution. I can wrap your project if I'm in competition. But first of all, I'm gonna win is this application.
Okay, we'll move on. So yes, that was an actual portfolio that was distributed, I'm guessing, to different architecture firms. I don't know if it was successful or not, but I thought we'd start off with that and maybe get your head spinning around things that you could do, because this is all about trying to get a job. That's the whole objective behind this. What you're looking at here now is a resume, just a plain old resume. And you probably built some of these in your life before, and you probably started off like I did there. And there really isn't any of the information I want to highlight here. This is just what a resume looks like initially. So I had this while I was at school, and I was about to initiate the process here of looking for some summer work while I was going to architecture school. And I thought, how on earth am I supposed to compete? How do I generate interest in myself with this? And that's the format, right? You're all familiar with that. That's what people do. They just go to some, Word document and they pick a format and they plug in their information, and they don't know if they should mention the fact that they've got 100 Scout badges or not. And they just say, well, I don't know, I'll do my best here. And it's really hard to distinguish yourself. So I felt that way in the summer of, I guess it was 2001. So I was still going to school at UC. Needed some summer work. I wanted to get something related and relevant. And so I began to kind of distribute these, and I thought, this isn't doing anything. So I decided, well, what the heck, I've got nothing to lose. Why don't I just, try to make something visual? I'll come back to that in a second here. So I decided I would take that kind of format of my resume, and I would just put the portfolio stuff right in there. So if they wanted all the information about my job experience and personal information and all the rest, I'm just going to just put the visuals right in there. It was a bit of a gamble. It definitely wasn't traditional format. It was the sort of thing that, perhaps people might have thrown out and just thought that's not the way we do it. But I guess I'm just trying to maybe make the point that it's perhaps worth gambling a little bit on this and doing something that's maybe a little bit bold. So anyway, I took this and I printed off, 20 of them, and I had them all nicely packed into envelopes, and I went downtown and I just began distributing them at architecture firms. Just walked to the front desk. I said, hey, can I leave this with somebody that, handles resumes and hiring? And the secretary or receptionist said, sure. And I think it was my second office I handed one of these in. By the time I got back downstairs to the sidewalk to move on to the next one, I got a phone call saying, can you come back up? So that was how I got my first architecture job. And it was actually because of this, the guy that, you know, that had it sort of handed to him from the receptionist said, yeah, it looked pretty interesting. I thought I'd just, you know, see if you were interested in working for us. And so anyway, that led to my first job at a company called CPV Architects. They've since been absorbed by Stantec, but that's how I tried to kind of, you know, get into this idea of a portfolio or showing off work. After I gained some experience at that firm, I refined it a little bit, kind of stuck with the same format. And at least the one on the right has a little bit more sort of substantial sort of architecture experience. And I had finished my thesis by the time I made the second one on the right. So that's just been kind of a format that I've trusted over the years. And luckily, you know, I've kind of had the same job now for a while, so I haven't had to kind of go through this process and face some of the anxiety that you guys might be facing. I sympathize with you for that. I know it can be a difficult process, but what I want to emphasize, I guess, when we talk about portfolios today, is that it's largely about first impressions. And it's important that you sort of play this visual game of attracting attention, but you want to do it in such a way that you're going to get the right kind of respect from those that you present to. And you have to, you know, you have to play the game of sort of clear visual communications, because that's not just about, you know, graphics. You know, what I'm showing here is obviously a lot about presentation graphics and about rendering and all the rest, but even if you're not doing that, you still have to kind of play this game of clear visual representation. So I'm going to back up a step here and show you a quote that I've shown before. This came up in a class, I can't remember when it was, but just scan that for a second. What's interesting about this quote is it didn't come from somebody in architecture. I finally tracked down the source of it. I think I kind of butchered it last time I presented it, third semester or something like that, but I've tracked down the proper source and got it properly.
Headphones dे दो, please.
And I'll carry on. This comes from somebody who does rocket design, as you can see there. So aerospace engineering. Now, I suspect if somebody's doing spacecraft design, they're probably not too terribly concerned with some of the graphics and the pretty pictures and the smoke and mirrors that sometimes we get caught up in. They're probably pretty technically focused. But if somebody with that kind of technical focus, you know, dealing with the world in a world where there's like, you know, hundreds of a millimeter kind of tolerance on pieces and parts and design, for them to say something like this, I think really kind of puts the emphasis on it. So what we're talking about here, of course, is that regardless of how technical we might be or how good the idea is or whatever the focus of the idea might be, we have to communicate it clearly. And that's what a portfolio is all about. We have to try to convey to somebody, you know, that we're capable and that we get it and that we're worth their investment. Now, having said that, I also want to bring up another point here. And this if you were in on our classes earlier today with the A&D group, we talked about portfolios, and Patrick was kind of abrupt when we asked him his opinion of a portfolio, and he kind of flat out just said, well, he said two things. He said, it's a good thing to do to sort of boost your confidence about what you can do. And I totally agree with that. And then he also said, though, that he didn't think that anybody really looked at his portfolio. He thought it was really maybe not such a, you know, a worthwhile endeavor. And I don't completely dismiss that either. Depending on where you interview, there might be, you know, less interest in your portfolio than you think. So we might not, depending on who we interview with, we might not be getting too bogged down in exactly what's in the portfolio or how it looks. It might just be about sort of showing people that you get it. And maybe just to kind of elaborate on that idea before I get into some other slides here, I'm just going to explain a concept that I think really kind of captures the point really well. And this is going to be a reference to a sport that you've probably never paid any attention to, but this is relevant. I watch the Tour de France a lot, and the way that the Tour de France works is that you have a 3-week race, and there are, in that 3 weeks, usually 4 or 5 days that are extremely difficult days where you have to climb these really steep slopes up to the tops of mountains. And then, you know, you have to be a really good climber, and the potential for you to sort of get too tired and fall behind is really, really quite substantial. Those are the days that typically somebody who wins the Tour de France is going to win. But in between, there are these other days where maybe there's only a little bit of really, you know, difficult sort of climbing to do. And so what they often say of those days is you're never going to win the Tour de France on those days, but you can certainly lose it. And so what I would say about your portfolios is that perhaps with some companies, you're never going to get the job because of your portfolio. But if you don't have a good portfolio, you could lose the job. So in other words, they might only spend seconds. I've heard of situations where they looked at a portfolio for maybe 30 seconds and they didn't really get into what was on the pages, and they didn't really talk to, you know, the person that was being interviewed about what the project was like. They just kind of flip. And in that 30 seconds, they gain this impression of whether or not that person really got it or not. So like I said, they might not have hired them because of the portfolio, but if the portfolio didn't show some good work and some good understanding, it could easily have caused them to not get the job. So at the very least, let's consider that this is a way of sort of showing or conveying to people that that you understand architectural graphics, you understand what drawings should look like, and that you're ready to participate. Okay, so we'll skip over these again. And maybe just to kind of pick up on something that Patrick mentioned to the A&D group this morning that I think is worth repeating. I think the major, actually maybe I'll ask you guys this. What do you think the major objective is in an interview? What do you think they're doing most? And if you heard Patrick's comments, feel free to chime in on this one.
About more so cultural fit.
About which?
Cultural fit with the company and the firm.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're on the right track. Elaborate on that a little bit. What do you mean by cultural fit?
You get along with the groups of the people. You follow a similar work style as they do.
Yeah, for sure. They're evaluating your personality, really. This is what I hear again and again and again from people that regularly interview our graduates. They're trying to get a feel for whether they think that you're going to play nicely with their employees. So, you know, in this 40-hour-a-week environment, they want to know what it's going to be like for their team to work with you and how well you're going to blend with that. So they're assessing your social skills, your confidence. They kind of assume that they're going to teach you what you need to know, which is a little condescending to us as a team of architectural and technologies instructors, because we like to think that we're preparing you for what you need to know, but they have this somewhat condescending way of saying, no, we'll teach them. You guys are just sort of giving them this sort of, head start. But so anyway, they in a lot of cases, they're just trying to assess whether or not they think you have the ambition, the interest, and then some of that kind of social skills, confidence, play well together type of approach to the job. And so that being the case, a lot of them, like I said, in a lot of cases, some of them say that, yeah, I look at the portfolio, but just as a way sort of confirming, but I kind of make up my mind based on the other things. Okay, so with that out of the way, assuming that, the portfolio does still play a role, let's talk about what you should include. That's always the big question. Students say, well, what should I put in there? Well, I would say it just depends on where exactly it is you want to work. That's the big question. You got to think to yourself, where am I going to get a job? And perhaps some of you at this moment are thinking, I don't care where I go to get a job. I just want to get a job. I just want to get out of the basement. I want to buy a car, pay off my loan, whatever it is. Is that fair to say? Maybe your parents are in the background nodding right now saying, yes, we just want you to get a job. So yeah, it's entirely possible that, you don't really know yet. You've had school experience and you've heard some stories told about what it's like to work in a residential firm and what it's like to work for a commercial firm, but you're like, well, I don't know where I'm going. So I would say it's probably more likely that you're going to sort of be trying to create this broad scope type portfolio, or as I'll show you in a couple slides here, something that maybe is a mix of both. But as you're aware, there's a lot of different places that you can end up working. So I've created this kind of spectrum here to describe, what might be on the left, a little bit more of sort of the creative realm, and that what might be over on the right, something a little bit more in the technical realm. And now that you're into your fourth semester, you've heard all kinds of stories about, working for Dean Thomas or working for Dialogue or Gibbs Gauge or whatever it might be. And I suspect you're forming somewhat of an opinion about where you think you'd like to end up. And as you've heard, generally speaking, if you're working in residential, there's going to be more opportunities for creative input. If you're working in a larger commercial firm, like a Dialogue or a Gibbs Gauge or Stantec, or I've got some other, logos there, even the city of Calgary, generally speaking, with those companies, the requirement is going to be that they want you to be really technically skilled. And they're hiring you as a technologist to do the technical things, to do the drawings, of course, the building science, the code reviews, you know, to deal with the city of Calgary with permits and such. They're hiring you for that because they've got other people that handle some of the more creative stuff. So as you've certainly heard many times by now, there's usually on a team like Dialogues, they've got architects and intern architects that generally look after the design ideas and a lot of the graphics, and they'll usually have somebody that deals with the renderings and the presentation material. So if you see a job opening for one of those types of companies, you need to have a portfolio that shows that you've got good competent skill and that you've got a great interest in the technical side of things. Now, if you see a job opening for Dean Thomas or Young Design or something residential, then you can probably, you know, mix it up a little bit and put some stuff in there that's going to be a little bit more along the lines of design or graphics or creative work. It can actually work against you if you're going into, I heard this from a friend of mine at one of these firms on the right. He said that one of the things that he's trying to assess when he interviews our grads is he's trying to assess whether they have an interest in design. And he's specifically trying to detect that so that he doesn't give them a job. That sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? So what they don't want is they don't want a situation where somebody just kind of slips into the firm, but then they grow dissatisfied over the years because they really want to do design work. And his response to that would be, well, you know, we don't hire architectural technologists in our firm to do design work. We hire architects for that. So like I said, that might be a situation where having a whole bunch of creative stuff in your portfolio kind of works against you. So ideally, you would sort of tailor your portfolio for these different situations. You'd say, oh, that's a job, you know, that's an interview for Dean Thomas. I've got this portfolio for that, and it's full of renderings and it's full of sketches and it's full of good graphics, as well as the technical stuff, of course. They're also going to want to hire you for that. And then if you have a job for Stantec, then you take a different portfolio in there. Now, I've identified a firm here in the middle, and there's probably a few more of these that I could have picked out, but remind me what the acronym stands for. I always forget this.
Formed Alliance Architecture.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, that's one in the middle where, you know, it is a firm that handles some larger projects. But there's a little bit more sort of intent with sort of design, and there's also a lot more work that gets done with graphics. And I suspect with a firm like that, there's more of an opportunity for you as a technologist to have some input creatively once in a while. Remember that regardless of which firm you go for, if it's a Dean Thomas or if it's a Dialogue or anywhere in between, it's about architecture and it's about construction. So the idea is that at some point along the line, they need to get some drawings done, and they're going to be looking to a technologist largely to get that done. So I would say, you know, in all of these, show your technical competence. If you're applying for a job with Young Design doing, you know, custom high-end residential, you still want to communicate that you have good technical knowledge. And then if it goes over towards the right side, you know, with the larger firms, then I would pull away some of that creative stuff because they're way more interested in you sort of being technically competent. Okay, so it might look something like this. Over on the left there towards the residential stuff, you know, some of the more kind of flashy graphics, the renderings, the presentation drawings, the sketches, somewhere in the middle there. For a company like FAAS, I just saw this one the other day. One of our students posted this. It was the flyover proposal. And as you can see there by that image in the middle, they deal with graphics, and every firm does. At some point, every firm has to communicate their ideas to the city, to the client, to the community, whoever it might be. There's always going to be this requirement to communicate, just like with you guys in your interim reports. You know, we might spend most of our time generating drawings and construction documents and resolving details, but there are those times where you have to communicate. So it's not to say it doesn't happen, it's just a question of who they hire to do it, and perhaps it's not a technologist. Okay, so over on the right, obviously the technical side of things, details, sections, some 3D details. I actually think 3D details would be a good thing to include in your portfolio because they show, you know, some nice graphic clout that would interest anybody on this spectrum. But if somebody's looking for technical knowledge, a 3D detail does a really nice job of communicating that. So that's why it maybe looks like a more sort of, I don't know, compulsive sort of, or a more compelling graphic on the right there that's kind of made its way into the technical side of things. I think that actually can kind of convey your technical knowledge very well. Okay, I'll pause there and not just keep talking all the way through this. Any questions about that, or any curiosity about, what sort of material might fit a company better? If there's any specifics in mind, we could discuss that as well, like specific companies. Although maybe you don't want to tip your cards and let somebody know where you're hoping to get a job.
Do you think there is like, would you build your portfolio kind of like this broad range of all the different things you can do and just go ahead like that, or would you want to cater your portfolio specifically for each person that you apply to?
Yeah, I think ideally, if your budget allowed this, I would spend the money and get, like, I don't know, 3 different portfolios, and have a technical one that you're going to take to Stantec, have a middle of the road one that could kind of cover everything, and then have one that maybe shows a little bit more skill in the sort of design and creativity side. I'll talk in a second here about format and about where to get these printed and how much that might cost and all that. But yeah, I think ideally you would build one for different situations.
With your portfolio, would you want to include like one element that's not maybe specifically what they're looking for, but is something that you think is a skill that they might find useful for you to have that could be incorporated into their work?
I think that's okay, but like I said, be really careful with that, because that situation I described, where he had said he's specifically looking for evidence that you're not interested in design. So, but yeah, I think if you do, let's put it this way: if you were to have something graphic that was just subtly graphic, it was the sort of thing that could show up in a design development, or sorry, a DP set of drawings, let's say. And it shows that you understand what those graphics look like and that you're capable. But then if most of your portfolio was, details and sections, so that kind of showed that your skills maybe leaned more towards that, I think that would be okay. So yeah, a little indication that you've got a broad set of skills wouldn't hurt, I suppose.
Thomas, I've joined you here.
Yep.
Is there anyone else in here? Did Delbach make it?
No, we haven't seen him so far. I think it's just you and me on the instructor side.
Okay. Thomas may get into this a little bit as he discusses some different formatting strategies, but another approach that can be taken in terms of being able to customize what you're presenting is using what is sometimes called design sheets. And design sheets are really, if you thought of your portfolio as a comprehensive, a complete record of all of your work, you might sort of pull, like you could literally pull sort of samples from your portfolio, and those are things that you're including with your initial application, those or your sort of your initial submission, whether you're delivering them electronically or whether you're following them with a hard copy. But they're sort of a teaser, or they're a sampling of your work, and that's a way that you can obviously pull from your collection of work to customize what you want to put in front of them as a priority for them to take notice of. I've always felt that there is a degree of sort of showmanship with this, that you do want to kind of bait your hook. You do want to sort of tease them a little bit, and you want to be able to sort of not put all your cards down right away and perhaps inadvertently take yourself out of the running or something. But being very careful about what you show someone, just enough to sort of get them interested, but not enough that you don't still hold a few cards up your sleeve. And it might be a way to sort of edit it without having to feel you have 3 distinct portfolios, but in fact, you've got sort of more of a comprehensive set of documents, and then you've got these sheets that you've pulled that have accompanied your resume, or are even sort of the things that you're sort of using as your main documents that you're talking over in an interview situation. And then if need be, you can go through your work. And that will also allow them, you'll be giving them the choice whether they want to take notice of things in your portfolio that may stand out to them that they maybe didn't notice, or invite a question, to kind of that last point about showing something that you think might interest them, that they might want to apply. That sounds very entrepreneurial, and it sounds very bold, and it sounds sort of like something that on the face of it you might think would be encouraged, but there certainly is a risk to that, and you must, I think, come into any interview prepared to flatter them, number one, and being exceedingly humble.
Yeah, good approach. Yeah, so I guess to come back to kind of the original question there from Taylor, maybe this will offer some other alternatives. So we're primarily just talking about print here. I really haven't brought up, the idea of having a website or doing some sort of digital presentation. That's certainly a very good idea. If you don't, and particularly, I guess, in the world of COVID, we don't know how long these conditions are going to linger, but you're not necessarily going to have the opportunity to sit across the desk from somebody and hand over a printed portfolio for a little while. So perhaps in another session, we could talk about some digital options. And there are many, Wix, for example. There's these really quite easy sort of online platforms. And really everything that I'm going to kind of that I've been talking about here, you could just sort of adapt, post on a website, give somebody a link in your resume or whatever. And perhaps even if you have this sort of an interview situation like this on Zoom or Teams, and you take control of the screen, and then you can kind of show them your digital print. So yes, we realize that there's a little bit of an adaptation that's required there because of COVID, but primarily this is about the printed format. To that end, what's been done in the past by students that kind of represents maybe a middle of the road, but versatile and certainly acceptable format is just the typical kind of coil bound portfolio or Surlox bound. And you can get these done a lot of places. Staples, West Canadian Graphics, there's all kinds of print shops that do this fairly easily. And what they'll do is they'll print your sheets. So you would go in there with a PDF, let's say with the 20 pages or so, and they would print them, and then they would do the hole punching and the binding, and maybe put like a nice laminate thick cover on it or something like that. And students generally come away from this, with about $20 or $30 less in their pocket. So as I said, if budget doesn't allow, or maybe just the amount of work doesn't allow you to do 3 separate ones, you could do sort of the middle of the road sort of versatile portfolio and print it like that. Another option is on the right side. You can get these portfolio cases that have just these kind of clear sleeves, and you can print your documents up and then just take them in and out depending on your interview. So we've had students do that in the past before, where they print off maybe 30 pages, and if they're going to Stantec, they put these 20 in. If they're going to Dean Thomas, they put these 20 in, then they adapt depending on where they're going. So I think that's a pretty good strategy as well. Maybe it doesn't come across quite as professionally as a sort of permanently bound solution, but I think it still has that good adaptability that you're more likely to need, I think, because you'll probably be willing to sort of pursue different options when it comes to your interviews. And if an engineering company says they're hiring, you'll probably sort of take the bait on that one and check it out at least. And so you'll want to have maybe a more versatile portfolio. I've also included there, and I can put this in the chat so you can just click on it as well, but you've probably seen on the internet that there are some options for printed books. Shutterfly is one of the bigger ones, but there's dozens and dozens of them. They do a nice job, certainly a more professional looking kind of permanent binding, and they have really nice options where they lay flat, so you're not fighting against the crease that you would get with a normal book. So they definitely present really, really well. They're obviously more expensive. I've also never come across one that offered an 11:17 format, and that's the format, the size that I would recommend. And that's because you generally want to have, as much paper space as possible so that you got lots of good detail on that sheet, particularly where you're displaying, some technical images. But not so big that you're tripping over this thing, or, you're taking up space on somebody's desk to show it off. You want this to be a nice portable, easily manageable format. So the nice thing about 11:17, easy to hand across the desk, pretty easy to flip through, but still large enough that they can see a lot of good detail in it. So that's the format in the past when we've had this as an assignment for students. That's the format that we've used. So still something I recommend.
I think, Thomas, you're dead on with that in terms of the size recommendation. And I think I would as well support Thomas in the notion that probably a more flexible solution is going to make you more comfortable with how you can customize it. And I think it would be sort of sad for you guys to feel that you're sort of stuck with a slightly outdated portfolio or something like that, and you're pursuing new challenges. So, but shop around, go into art stores. I'm sure like art stores like Mona Lisa down on 17th Avenue. Those are places where you can probably find a really nice selection of really nice looking, simple portfolios that allow you to slide sheets in and out without having to be contemplating sort of a book or a more fixed format.
It's very unlikely. I know in the graphic world and in the world of like photographers, it's common for them to keep the portfolio so they can kind of look at it a little bit longer. That's quite unlikely in architecture, but I guess that's maybe one of the nice things about having a portfolio sleeve like that is if they said to you, hey, can I hang on to this? You might not feel so bad, but maybe you could strike a deal and say, you can hang on to it if you give me a job so I can pay for it. Okay. The next big item, I guess, having dealt with that, is just going to be, okay, well, what do I do? How do I put this together? What's this thing supposed to look like? And there are a ton of options, and I think this is probably where the greatest exploration is going to occur. How do I piece this thing together? How do I make it look decent? And I'm just going to maybe try to spark a little bit of discussion here by showing you those two images. Now, any guesses? What on earth do you think I'm getting at here by sort of comparing that image on the left to the image on the right?
One of them is more like sheet layouts in Revit.
Okay.
Simplicity.
What was that, sorry?
Simplicity. Simple.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I know I shouldn't be trying to have you just read my mind here. Maybe I'll just stop being coy. But what I've often said to students in the past is you want the work to speak for itself. If it's a good drawing, if it's a good detail, a good rendering, whatever it might be, really it should be able to speak for itself. So you're not necessarily using the portfolio. You don't want to draw attention to the portfolio itself. You want the portfolio to just be this kind of medium that allows people to look at your work. And I guess what I'm saying is here on the right, I've never understood why this happens, but there's always this huge appetite for these just ridiculously ornate picture frames. And you can still see this today. If you go into I don't know, a Michaels or something, there's these entire departments that are devoted to, making these elaborate choices with regards to picture frames. If the artwork is good, then just put a simple black border around it with a little bit of space and let the artwork speak for itself. That's always been my opinion on this subject. And to that end, I would say with your portfolios, maybe that they don't have to be quite that bland, but just be aware that you're not doing something with the portfolio that starts to compete with the work that you're trying to display. Keep the focus on the drawings. You want to convey, your ability to generate some interesting graphics or to do a really technical architectural drawing, whatever the case might be. Don't get too worried about what exactly the format of all the borders and the graphics might be. And I'll show you some examples that I think do a pretty good job of illustrating that. Another thing that you can do, if you want some ideas, this is one of the best resources that I've come across. And this was a student that pointed this out to me, I think it was just last year. You've perhaps come across this website called issuu.com. And if you go to issuu.com and just type in the search window here, architecture portfolio, you get a really nice, long list here of some student sample architecture portfolios. So lots to look through here to generate some ideas. Now, as you're probably aware from having looked at, a lot of case studies in ArcDaily and a lot of sample drawings and other, sources, architectural graphics tend to be pretty subtle. If you were to go to, I don't know, if you were going to go onto Instagram or Pinterest and start looking at graphic designers, web designers, whatever, that type of work, you'd see a lot more flourish, a lot more sort of eye-catching, bold designs and such. Generally speaking, when we're dealing with architecture, we're talking about some pretty subtle graphics. And I realize we're getting into the realm here of some, artistic types of ideas, and isn't art subjective and isn't it in the eye of the beholder? Well, yes, of course it is. But generally speaking, you'll notice that if you want to get the attention of somebody who's hiring for an architecture office, you're going to want to be pretty subtle about things. And like I said, just keep the focus on the actual work. Now, I just picked this one randomly. I'm not necessarily saying this is a great example, but having said that, I think this actually does a pretty good job.
It's a pretty great example.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of really bold, crazy text. This doesn't look like a 1980s breakdancing t-shirt with all sorts of random pink paint splashes and zigzags and lightning bolts. It's pretty subtle, okay? And like it or not, that's kind of the world of architectural graphics, and you have to kind of play that game a little bit if you're going to try to convince somebody that you can play as part of the team. So, like I said, this one was just kind of pulled up randomly, but I think this is a pretty good one actually. And I don't think this one would really scare anybody away from hiring you, thinking that you were way more interested in design. Maybe not. Maybe a Gibbs Gauge interview wouldn't go so well if you were showing this many renderings, but as I said, establish some sort of a layout strategy that's subtle, okay? And I'll show you again some examples I think that do a pretty good job of that. Okay, so I'll post the link for this as well, but like I said, it's pretty easy to find, issuu.com, and then just use the search window and type in architecture portfolio, and you'll have lots and lots and lots of stuff to look at. Where did I want to go next? So I am going to show you some student examples, and this has been an assignment for quite a while, for many years leading up till now. And this is one of the ones that always kind of stands out in my mind. I like this one. I would say this is an example of a middle of the road portfolio. This one does have a lot of renderings and design, work in it. So maybe not the best type of content, I guess, to take to a dialogue type of interview, but does a nice job of showing some good skills. It's got some good variety in it. And it's still just nice and concise. It kind of gets to the point fairly quickly. So let me just show you some. This is only 18 pages worth. Don't feel like you have to do, a long portfolio. In fact, I would say don't do that. You want to kind of get your point across quickly. Nobody's going to look at your 50-page portfolio in a job interview. So some basic information here about the student. A picture's not a bad idea. And then he just gets right into the work. One of the things I like about this portfolio is that there's a nice change in pace, so to speak. So there's some pages where there's some text and some smaller images, and then for variety's sake, he switches to a full image, with text on it kind of approach. Some technical drawings here, so showing some, understanding of how working drawings should look and the amount of information that should be on them. So again, switching to some full page images. And some good presentation images as well. That kind of nice blend of technical and sort of evocative images. And then back into some more technical stuff. So again, if this was if somebody walking into an interview at Dialog or Stantec or Gibbs Gauge, I would say maybe a little bit too much attention here being paid to some of the design stuff. You'd want to have some more of these types of images in there. But what I like about this example for, this image, for example, is that it's graphically interesting. He's done something a little different, not inconsistent, but just different. It conveys the technical knowledge, conveys that he understands how working drawings should look. But there's also still some variety in here so that it looks interesting and maybe a little bit more compelling. And there we go. So only 18 pages worth, not too much to it. And I'll show this one as well. This was a student that graduated a couple of years ago. He happened to have some experience with graphic design, and so you'll see, some pretty good handling here of, I believe it was Illustrator he used for this. It's nice to have some sort of orientation, kind of some thematic elements, just to kind of let people know what they're looking at, what page they're on. And about the same length here, so 26 pages. Some of these more technical documents are loading a little bit more slowly. Some residential stuff, and you can see he's labeled that all here on the side. So some details. I would say details are an essential element. Put some details in your portfolio regardless of where you're going. Remember, that's kind of the whole premise of the Architectural Technologies program, is that you're ready to assume the role of the person that knows how all the pieces come together. You need to show that you get assemblies. That's maybe one of the most important things that you need to convey with your portfolio. So some good details, some 3D details, as I said, graphically more interesting, plus they convey that you've got some good competence. And then he gets into some, you know, a very clearly marked design and presentation section. Subtle, you know, nothing too overwhelming. Some really nice, bold, eye-catching colors and contrast. Good use here of the Revit section box and some other sort of presentation elements. And then on to some of the residential stuff. And then he happens to have had some experience, you know, in a prior life with some graphics, so he decided he would throw that in as well, which I think is a nice touch. Wouldn't want that to be, you know, first and foremost. If you walked into a Gibbs Gauge interview with a whole bunch of graphics at the start, they just right away they'd be like, no, this is not the person. So maybe at the end, perhaps, but again, for Gibbs Gauge, I would say probably not. Okay, so there's 2 samples. What do you think? Did you like what you saw there? Would you hire that person?
I thought it was good that he started out with like the technical stuff and then he went into like renderings and presentation. So he presented the most important first.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think that is the right approach. If at the start of your portfolio you're showing off all the graphics, you got to think like, who pays for this stuff? If a project, you know, has a budget for getting a building done, what part of that goes towards, you know, flashy graphics? It's probably pretty tiny. So anyway, don't want to get into that too much. You've kind of heard that topic addressed, but yeah, I would agree. I think this does a really nice job of just saying, you know, here's the technical ability. The rest is just kind of flourish. Any other comments on this one?
I think it's cool that the index is like interactive, like it highlights where you are as you go. But yeah, or I don't know if interactive is the right word, maybe live, but yeah.
Yeah, I really like that too. I hate being on a web page where I go so many clicks in that I no longer know where I am. So if there's some sort of element that always sort of gives me some orientation, so I know, oh yeah, there's this information still to come or whatever. So yeah, I like those elements. I think that's a good choice. You got some graphic background, don't you, Julian?
Yeah, I did a undergrad at ACAD as well in media art and object design. So a little bit of graphics background, yeah.
Yeah.
One question I had is like navigating construction drawings. I've kind of found it difficult to kind of, you know, go from a detail to an assembly and so forth, like when it's not my drawings. Is there any way to hyperlink your drawings so that if you clicked on a detail in a section, it would bring you to that actual detail? Or is that not really a thing?
You know what? Yeah. I've noticed that Bluebeam does that.
Yeah, exactly. If you print Bluebeam PDF.
Yeah, Bluebeam, like a section head, it will actually like keep the link in that. So just like in Revit, you can click on a section head. So yeah, if who you're getting an interview with has Bluebeam, you could say, yeah, it's just easy to navigate. Just works just like, and they'll probably know that if they have Bluebeam, of course. But I'm not aware if Acrobat, if PDF can do that. I suspect it can. But yeah, anyway, it's a good thing to know for sure, how to help people sort of navigate your portfolio.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So what I'm seeing in their portfolios, they're good work. My question is, I spoke with my friend earlier today, and I mentioned that I didn't want to include my first semester project because it is not pretty. But she said it was good to include just to show the progress of.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion on that? Would you like your best foot forward, or would you like to see how you progressed?
They're very interested in your ability to progress for sure. They, like I said, they are going to assume this role of being your sort of mentor, your master. So they want to know that you've got a lot of ambition and that you've got a lot of ability to progress. So I don't think that's a bad idea. I wouldn't devote too much time to it. Like, don't present your first year rendering with its complete lack of contrast and no attention to materials as this like masterpiece. Maybe it can just be sort of, sorry if that offends, just tuck it off to the side a little bit and just sort of represent that this is where I started. and then, you know, some larger images for your capstone rendering or whatever, your capstone drawing, whatever it might be. You know, I think that's okay. I think it's okay to include your first semester stuff because it shows that you're progressing.
I think one of the things that you have to be extraordinarily careful of, and this is a commentary as much on design as it is on your portfolio, is editing. And to that end, I don't think you have to feel sort of obligated that let's say in your first semester you did 4 renderings of your house. You don't have to feel obligated to put 4 renderings of your house in your portfolio.
Right. Yeah.
And to your question about, you know, maybe some of your work that isn't, you know, isn't representative of your current abilities. You know, maybe to Thomas's point, you might want to show that you've progressed, but that you can show that by showing a very small portion of that work, because I think you've got to be pretty careful about that. And I can imagine myself certainly flipping through a portfolio, and there's probably a tendency to show it chronologically, which there doesn't necessarily have to be. But if you're showing your work chronologically and the first image I see is a somewhat clumsy or relatively novice attempt at residential construction, I'm now climbing that hill, right? You're now having to convince me. I think it's only human that we tend to sort of jump to a judgment. And if there's a stack of these on my desk that I'm reviewing, it's like, I think we have to speak very honestly about that. I think you have to be very, very careful to put your very, very best work forward. And you do want to represent what your current abilities are. And perhaps, you know, maybe you can tell the story of how you've developed it, but I can't imagine you wanting to finish on a down note, and I can't imagine there being much advantage to starting on a down note. So you have to be very, very careful about that. And it really is a question of editing. You're under no obligation to show all of your work. And to that end, you know, I think you show your very best work, the work that you can explain and tell a good story with.
Thank you.
Yeah, I tend to think, you know, I should actually ask those people that I talk to about portfolios. I should ask them what they would think of an image like this. Some of you have seen me show this image before. I think we brought this up in our last Thursday afternoon meeting, but you know, this one does a nice job of sort of conveying some really good graphic skills, so you know how to kind of make the images pop and it looks interesting and compelling. But there's some, you know, really intense technical competence being conveyed, you know, with an image like this. So you know, that's why we did our last presentation and talked about 3D details. I think there's a good opportunity there to kind of do a, you know, 2 birds with 1 stone approach, where you can kind of convey the graphic skill at the same time that you convey that you've got some pretty good knowledge when it comes to the technical stuff. So, and this was done by a professional. This is KPF is Cohn Pedersen Fox out of New York, and this was a project where the technologist, they don't really call them that in the United States, but the person in charge of, you know, the details had to do a lot of really elaborate exploration into how to, you know, develop these custom curtain wall extrusions and such. So anyway, they represented that all with some cool Revit graphics. Okay, we're kind of winding down here with time. I'm trying to cover a whole bunch of things, and I wanted to get into the last part, which is, as I said, maybe where most of your curiosity will lie, and that's going to be around, well, you know, what do I do? How do I put this together? What's the software? What are the techniques? What are the methods? And if you want to have some really compelling, interesting looking images, well, how do I do that? I don't have time, of course, for that. We've only got 9 minutes left. I'm not going to be able to talk about, you know, all these different methods. I'm hoping next week to do some videos on some of those approaches. So how to generate those really cool looking Bjarke Ingels, you know, massing diagrams, for example, how to do some cool looking sections and all those, stacking floor plates and all those cool things that we see when we go to, Instagram and look at, people that do some really cool graphics. So I'll get into that with some later videos on my YouTube channel. But I thought what I would do right now, just to kind of make a few points about choosing the right tool, is I would talk about why perhaps Illustrator is the tool of choice. And what I want to do is I want to show you first the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. You're probably well aware of what Photoshop can do. It's the one that people tend to learn first. And that's largely because Photoshop is an editing program. So we tend to start with a picture, and then we use Photoshop to crop it or add more contrast, or maybe to, I don't know, take out somebody's red eye or take somebody out of the picture once we've broken up with them, or whatever the case might be. So Photoshop being an editing tool, we start with something. Illustrator is probably, not the program that people learn first, because you have to kind of build stuff first. Anyway, that being the case, aside from that, there's two other sort of crucial distinctions between Photoshop and Illustrator that make Illustrator, I would say, the better choice. And I'm going to show you what that difference is. Okay, so I'm going to click on File here in Photoshop and open up a PDF. And this is going to be a building section that was generated in AutoCAD. Would have been the same thing if I had generated this in Revit. The idea here is just that it's a drawing. So when you've got a drawing that you worked hard on, you want to put it in your portfolio, if you open it up in Photoshop, here's one of the limitations you're going to face. It's going to ask you right away when you import this PDF, and that was the format that I used to get it out of AutoCAD. It's going to ask me what resolution I want here. So I have to tell it how many pixels per inch that I want to basically, convert this PDF into. So generally speaking, 300 pixels per inch is the sort of print standard. When you look at a magazine or a printed book, usually there's 300 DPI for that book. And that way our eyes don't detect the pixels. It's nice and sharp and deep, and it's we don't detect any pixels. So this is what happens when you do that in Photoshop. Now I'm just going to add some white to the background here and kind of explain what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to, well, I'll rotate it as well, I guess, real quickly here so this looks a little bit more clear. So I'll just do a quick 90 degrees counterclockwise rotation. And this is the point that I want to make. We don't notice that there's a lack of sharpness in this image as long as we've got enough pixels. But as soon as we zoom in on this, you'll see what you've noticed perhaps on your phone when you take a picture, and on your phone it looks fantastic and you think that would look great as a poster. And if you were to take it to a shop and get it printed as a poster this big, what would you see? Well, you'd see pixels, of course. You'd see noise like this. So Photoshop is what's called a raster program. All that means is that it uses pixels and it builds kind of a mosaic of pixels. And if there are enough pixels packed tightly, you don't notice the illusion that it's just this kind of composition of little dots. Now, if you wanted to just print that and all the line weights were fine and it was good to go, that would be okay. You could print that in Photoshop to make your portfolio and you'd probably be fine. The only thing you'd have to be aware of course, is that it takes a lot of data. You'd have to have a lot of pixels in the file to get that detail. And by the time you get 20 pages worth in a portfolio, you're going to have a massive, massive pixelated file. It would probably be separate pages, but it would just be a lot of information that would be hard to handle, and your laptop would really chug quite a lot to work with that info. So here's what Illustrator looks like. If I go File,
Thomas, if I can just support what you're saying there too.
Sure.
One of the things that's very distinct, like even if you think about a photograph is a full sort of body, if you will, of colorized pixels. But an architectural drawing, the nature of it graphically is that it's a contrast. It's the contrast typically between black and white, right? The paper that is sort of beyond the line and the line itself. And further to that, architectural drawings, as we know, contain various lines of various line weights. And some of those line weights and some of those fonts and all of the annotation can get very, very, very fine. And 300 is, that's even optimistically going to look good. If I've ever, for whatever reasons, been having to use a rasterized image that is of an architectural drawing, there are times where I've gone as high as 1200 DPI to get the kind of crispness that I would want when I'm printing that. And I mean, as Thomas says, our time is limited, but this gets quite complicated in terms of the way things look on a screen and the way things will look on paper. They usually require a much higher level of resolution, of course, to print clearly on paper. But that's to Thomas's point, if you are really looking for extremely sharp, crisp detail with an architectural drawing, you will need probably, at least 300, likely 600, potentially even more, and that's going to turn into an enormous, enormous file.
And you're already very aware of the limitations of your laptop, so you don't want to induce any more work on them. But Taylor, did we get cut off right at 5?
No, I was gonna say, if you want, you could keep going. The only thing I have is a meeting with James, who is here anyways, so we can just do that whenever. So like, if you want, you can just keep going.
Okay, it's not my intention to go on till 7 o'clock, so but I'll spill over a little bit here if that's all right, and maybe just we'll go to about 5 or 10 after. So
well, and this is recorded anyway, so people can come back and watch if they need to.
Okay, so this is the comparison then. Remember what happened in Photoshop. I opened up the PDF, which was generated in either Revit or AutoCAD, and it asked me for that step there where it converted the vector graphics, that's what we'll see here in Illustrator, into raster. So when I open a PDF in Illustrator, I don't get that dialog box, and that's because Illustrator speaks the same language. So Revit and AutoCAD are primarily vector-based programs, which just means that they deal in the world of sort of shapes and formulas that are used to kind of create graphics. So what you'll get in AutoCAD and Illustrator and Revit, for the most part, is just a really crisp, clear representation of a line or a circle or something diagonal. And we don't typically tend to get that in Photoshop, although there are some exceptions that I'm not going to get into. So this is kind of to make the point here about what Illustrator looks like, and then this will kind of reinforce some of the things that Patrick was saying about editability, and that's really the main reason why I would recommend using Illustrator. So if I click on the artwork here and click Edit, and I'm just going to transform this, object, transform, and rotate this 90 degrees, there we go. And you'll see that when I zoom in on this now, that it's sharp. Now, it's true that there is a little bit of error that occurred here with how it sort of translated the text. You can see it's a little bit faceted and jagged. There are ways of fixing that, but maybe I'll just zoom in on like this diagonal element here. So when I was zoomed in this much in Photoshop, we saw the steps, we saw the pixels in the mosaic. That doesn't occur in Illustrator. So not only do we preserve the sharpness and we get a much smaller file size in addition to that, but I also preserve some editability. So let's say, for example, that, I don't know, I needed to have a heavier line here representing grade. If I click on this line, I'm able to change the thickness of that line. So I have the ability to change line weights in here. I can move elements if it's not in the right place, or if I don't want it there, I can easily get rid of it. So all these individual entities maintain their selectability and their editability in Illustrator, something that didn't exist in Photoshop. Now it's true in Photoshop, I can use the pixel tools and I can use some selection windows. If I go over to that grade line on the side there, I could do stuff like this, and I could, tools do exist that allow me to do something similar, but it's going to be a heck of a lot more work and a lot more fuss. So generally speaking, if you're still manipulating your graphics and still trying to kind of, tweak things and refine them, you're going to have a much easier time doing that in Illustrator just because it maintains that editability. And then in addition to that, I would recommend using Illustrator as your layout tool. Illustrator has a really good tool for this, and it's just called the Artboard tool. And I realize this is going to get into a whole bunch of things that we could elaborate on for much more time, but just kind of remember this is possible. If I click File, New here in Illustrator, I'll get this new document window, and I can just tell Illustrator that I want to create a 17-inch by 11-inch. Apparently graphic artists always use the horizontal dimension first, so instead of saying 11 by 17, I'll say 17 by 11. And what I can do is I can tell Illustrator that I want multiple artboards. So in anticipation of doing a 20-page or whatever 15-page portfolio, I can set this all up so that I can see it all at once, and I can create some consistent graphics for all of those sheets. So as I said, I've got 17 by 11 specified. I'm going to have 20 artboards. Generally speaking, if you're going to be printing, you want CMYK color. I'll leave it at 300 DPI for a nice sharp resolution. And again, I guess that might sound a little confusing because we just talked about Illustrator being a vector-based tool. Well, it's just anticipating that that's what's going to be printed in the end. Anyway, well, we can elaborate that on a later video, but I'll click create and you'll see that what it gives me is this layout of these 20 sheets. And so what I can do now is I can just, let's say, focus on this sheet. There's one single 11 by 17, and I can go about here creating the format or the general sort of framing that I want for my portfolio. So maybe I decide to put a little framing window here, and then I'm going to add to that maybe a little spot for my text to go here. And then I'll say, you know, just some basic information that's going to repeat on every page. And I'm doing this because I want some consistency. So I'm hoping that when I set this up, and now if I look at the full set, again, there's the layout. And the idea is that I can just select these elements that I put on this one page, copy them to my clipboard, and then this allows me to edit and paste on all artboards. There we go. So you can kind of use the layer tool here to kind of set up your consistent elements, paste them to all of your artboards, and then you've established that consistency. And then the next step might be to say, well, on page 14, I want to have my rendering, and on page 15, I want to have, you know, my sketch. And that might be a nice way of kind of setting things up for your layout. So if this is the first time you've seen Illustrator, I realize that that's not nearly enough information to allow you to feel sort of confidently able to go ahead and start creating your portfolio, but I'm going to endeavor to create some additional content to kind of help you out with that. This is something that I've never done in the past, but it occurred to me recently that if you really want an easy tool to do this in, you're already quite familiar, of course, with Revit and Sheets. So I think it would be possible to do what you need to do just in Revit. Same sort of approach. You could set up, you know, on your sheet portion here of your browser, you could set up all 20 sheets, set up a title block so that there's a nice consistent look between them, and then just go about using the, you know, insert tool and importing images if you've got some graphics and some renderings that you want to bring in. And then, of course, you've got a direct way to just sort of bring in drawings, not only if they're part of the file, like you could just, if you had a drawing in here, you could just drag it onto the sheet, but then you can also import PDFs. So if you had drawings from another project that you want to bring in here, maybe I'll just test that out here actually. So import PDF, I'll navigate to that same building section that we saw. And yeah, it's this one here. I haven't used this tool all that much, so oh, that's interesting. It's actually going to rasterize it. Okay, so there's some things I'd want to kind of experiment with here, I guess. Like I said, this is kind of new territory for me, but it occurred to me that if you're feeling a little daunted about, you know, learning a new program like Illustrator, I think you've got really all you need here just with Revit to kind of set up your multi-page document here. That might be the sort of the easiest way to go about this. This image is going to be rasterized, of course, because it asked me for that step, but I believe there's a way to keep the vector information of that PDF and bring it into your sheets in Revit.
Yeah, most of your stuff should be in Revit anyway, so.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something in there that I missed, but I'm sure that's possible.
Yeah.
Vector program should be able to speak to vector data. So,
Thomas, I'll ask just because I'm sure you'll have an opinion. What do you think about InDesign?
InDesign, yeah, if you're not aware of InDesign, it's Adobe's publishing program. So it's meant for if you're doing like a, I don't know, an essay or a book, and you want to have a whole bunch of text. And one of the nice tools that InDesign has is that you can basically paste in, you know, an entire book's worth of text, and there'll be like a run-on feature that sort of just allows the text to keep spilling over to the next page. And there's other tools as well, but that's one of the prime tools that people are leveraging when they use InDesign. I don't think it's a necessary tool for us because we don't have run-on text. You can kind of treat each individual page, you know, on its own. So yeah, I don't think InDesign is, I've had students use it in the past, but I think it's overkill. I don't think it's the right tool for this.
It's a lot better for very long form text documents. I used it for our project proposal this semester, And I got about halfway through creating it and was like, I really wish I just did this in Illustrator. It would have been so much better.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear, I think both of you offer that comment. I mean, it was always my understanding that InDesign was more of the page layout and Illustrator was more of the vector creation tool, and Photoshop was the raster editing composition tool. And I mean, I know I've played around with InDesign. I mean, as Thomas knows, I use another program entirely, but I guess where maybe I thought there might be a little compassion or a little optimism for InDesign is that the Illustrator can be a little overwhelming sometimes, and it might be a little more horsepower than what you might need for it. It's certainly the right tool for vector, heavy duty vector based editing, but if you feel a little daunted by it, and just in terms of placing images and adding titles and adding bits of text and creating multiple pages, my opinion is InDesign might be a bit more accessible to some of you. But I think as Thomas stumbled on towards the end there, much of what you're doing, and certainly the I think prime expectation that can be communicated in a portfolio could be done in Revit.
Yeah. I would use Revit before I used Word, Patricia.
But I'll tell you this, I would never, ever use Photoshop.
Yeah.
To do a portfolio sheet. Never.
Yeah, too hard to edit. The file sizes will be absolutely enormous. And inevitably, you're going to end up with some image that just isn't going to be sharp. It's going to be pixelated and nasty looking. So yeah, I don't.
It's just absolutely the wrong tool. It's an image editor. It's not in any way designed for page layout, and it's totally at odds with essentially what we're producing, which is sharp vector-based, line-based graphic representation of construction.
I just went and retrieved my thesis from the shelf there. So that was the one time I used InDesign, because again, it was about a lot of words that had to kind of continue on to the next page and the next page. So for that kind of a layout situation, definitely the best idea. So, but your call on whether you use the Revit approach or the Illustrator approach or InDesign. I definitely would not recommend using Word. You have tremendous patience, Patty, if you got through that. I find Word is one of the most frustrating programs I've ever used.
Yes.
Simply because it just makes too many assumptions. Every time you do something, it assumes that you want this, and you just can't like override and say, no, just let me put it together. Like, it's so frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you want to maybe do like another one of these sessions in a few weeks, or do you want to just distribute the videos that you said you were going to work on over the next week?
I think probably the most valuable lesson would be just to discuss Illustrator and talk about how to navigate it. And I'm going to endeavor, with 20 hours to my credit next week. Well, I guess a little less than that. Anyway, I'm going to endeavor to get some videos done and post them. So we'll see what happens. If I can't quite get to them, then yeah, I wouldn't mind doing another one of these Thursday afternoon sessions just to address that, because I think it is good to know Illustrator for sure.
I think so too. I've used it for very basic things, but I'd like to know how to go more in depth. I've used like some of the templates too for creating logos, but yeah, it's that's kind of faking it till you make it. It'd be good to know how to make your own from the ground up.
Yeah, it's a really cool program. I can get lost in it, just messing around with, all the logo work and other graphics that, come up in this program. But
I would, again, here I am sounding like the dissenting voice. I would say that in terms of faking it until you make it, that kind of comment, your drawings and your output out of Revit should not have to be fluffed up in a vector-based graphic program to represent what your skill set is. And as Thomas will have to concede here, like when you're importing PDFs and vectorized output out of CAD programs into Illustrator, even under the best conditions, that stuff usually comes in with a lot of extra line work, weird things that are grouped together, the way blocks translate and families translate. You can really start getting into the weeds on some of that vector editing in those programs. And I always use a layout program to lay out portfolio work or to generate sort of commercial stuff, if you will. I always do. I've never used sort of the drafting program or that as a native software to produce marketing stuff. I've never done that, but it's always been a pain in the ass to deal with some of that line editing work in a vector-based software, whether it's Illustrator, InDesign, CorelDRAW, you name it. And I will often have my drafting program open, and I will be affecting those changes to the core drawing, the core file, and then re-exporting, as opposed to fooling around with I'll limit the amount of fooling around that I have to do in the vector-based graphic program, and make sure that my drawings out of my CAD program are trying to communicate what I want graphically. It can get nasty.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ideally, you've done all the work you needed to do with the drawing so that they don't need any further tweaking. And you did your due diligence on line weights and line types and everything else, and it's ready to go. And all you got to do is just, do the layout. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's become a real graphic style, and as Thomas, or I think, had some of his examples early on, the illustrated, like if you go to Studio North and every other architecture firm that wants to signal that they're cool, they heavy line weights, all this sort of graphically re-represented architectural work. But then I think that starts to turn us back into some of the initial questions that Thomas began the presentation on, which is, what are you trying to communicate with your work and your portfolio, and who's your audience? And,
Yeah, true.
So careful.
Okay. Well, we won't keep you any longer. I guess, like I said, this is a topic that can rattle on for a very long time, but I'll see what I can cover in the next couple weeks, and then we'll maybe make an appointment for another session here to talk about whatever didn't get covered in the videos, and we'll bring it up again, and we'll get you working. That's the objective, right?
No, that sounds good to me. I'll message you after the reading. We can figure out what to do from there. And if not, I know Alla also had a bunch of ideas for the next Nerd Club sessions as well. So
did we all freeze there, or was that just my end? Sorry.
Okay.
I'm not sure. But yeah.
Okay.
No. Okay, that time I saw it.
Okay, so I can answer questions that maybe were popping up here now. I'll stick around and just kind of deal with them in the chat. But otherwise, yeah, we'll sign off, I guess, and we'll address this again after you come back from the reading week break.
Thank you, Thomas.
Okay.
If I can offer one more comment to you, guys, your portfolio, this is all super important stuff, but your portfolio will not get you the job. Okay, your portfolio will not get you the job. Like your interview with a good portfolio will get you the job. But if you blow the interview, you could have the best portfolio anyone's ever seen. It will not get you the job. That's just kind of keeping it real, guys. This is really important stuff. You want to be able to present your stuff, the very best work. It's essential. It's, as I said this morning with some of you, were chatting a bit about this. It's what gives you confidence, I think. It's what you as you're putting your portfolio together, you're investing more time with your work. You're learning. You're learning your own work. You're able to then confidently speak about your work. But your portfolio will not get you the job. you've got to interview well.
So thank Patrick and Thomas, thank you so much for coming to talk with us today.
bet.
And it's definitely like a really good insight that like, you know, it's a bit of the personality too, and like making sure to know your audience. So this has definitely been like super helpful for me. I'm sure it has been for everyone else. So thank you so much for sticking around after class.
Okay. Okay. See some of you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Hey, Tessa. Before I have to sign off, but hey, Pierre.
Oh, hey, Amanda. How are you?
Hi, teacher is still with her hands up.
How are you guys?
Oh, you didn't ask her a
Pretty good.
question. I thought that they would stay.
Yeah, I thought Thomas said he was gonna stay. But it's okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. He's busy.
Thought so too.
Yeah.
That's okay. It was a menial question.
Oh,
Yeah, me too. I have quite a
We're
few
still
questions.
recording.
Oh, well, I guess
How are you guys doing?